I met Carrie Tuttleman, I'm not sure it was in this century, maybe. It might have been in a prior century. Carrie was like inner circle member number 1 30-some years ago, and has continued his membership long before I was involved in inner circle. And the one thing, we moved him from a group Tuesday to Thursday, and he commented that the last 5 groups that he was in all disbanded, and the only common denominator was Carrie's membership in those groups. So, Carrie works with families in transition, so ownership transition, leadership transition. If you go to Amazon and look for business plan books, there'll be 100,000 or more. Carrie really wrote the book and introduced the concept to our business world of the owner's plan. So as owners, what are your goals, values, and needs? And he introduced that through his book called The Balance Point, that's up there mentioned. And it really is important work. He's done this work internationally. The Family Firm Institute uses his curriculum as a training module for their members, and then similar organizations in other countries have invited Carrie to bring his work. So it's really, really meaningful to me that he's willing to come here and share a little different topic. I think all the people that didn't show are these underperforming owners, because none of you would be in that category, but Carrie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jeff, for the gracious introduction. You almost stole my introduction, but not quite. So, I started thinking about ownership about 30 years ago. And one of the first things I did, like anybody would do, is I went down to Barnes & Noble to try and find some books on ownership, right? Isn't that what you do? And like Jeff said, I found books on how to be a better leader, and how to be a better manager, and how to grow your company, and how to communicate better, and how to be a better salesperson, and how to manage your finances. But I didn't see anything on ownership. There was zero. And I started to think, why is that? And I pondered that for quite a while. And then one day I asked a friend of mine, I told him a story, and I asked him, why aren't there any books on ownership? And he said, it's so obvious that no one needs to write a book about it. And I said, really? And the more I thought about it, the more odd it became, the more difficult it became, the more confusing it became. And so I started thinking about it, and I did write a book about it. And I started speaking about it, because what owners do is very confusing. And normally, when I have more time, I do this exercise that really solidifies this idea of what owners do. But what I want to do with this group is just walk you through it, so you guys can just sit back and eat. And so I asked a question, and the question is, what's the most important thing you do as an owner? That's a good question, right? Just a relatively good question. I've done this exercise, I don't know, 3-4 dozen times. Get the same answers every time. And I'm going to put them up, and I'm going to show you what the audiences say. Okay, there's develop relationship with customers, right? More effective operations. Grow the business. deal with poor performers. Starting to look familiar? Make a good culture. If we had more time, I would ask you guys to add to this list. But this is a pretty good list. And I'll put this one here. Achieve company objectives. And we get done with this exercise. It's a good list. And I tell people, this is a great list. It's a really good list. There's only one problem with this list, and that is that everything on this list is wrong. Everything on this list is wrong. These are not the most important tasks that owners do. And then people look at me, and it's like, Jeff, why don't you bring this guy here to speak to us? This guy's nuts. So then I do part 2 of the exercise. And part 2 is a little bit harder, but now you have to kind of use your thinking caps here. So here's the question, part 2. If you're an owner or a part owner of a business, but you don't work in the business, okay, can you visualize that? You don't work in the business. You're a shareholder, but you're not an employee or a director. So if you own part of a business, but you don't work there, how many of these on this list do you think you ought to do? Do you think you ought to develop relationships with customers? Anybody think that? No. Should you go in and make the operations more effective? Should you be growing the business? Should you be dealing with poor performers? Should you be making a good culture? Should you be achieving company objectives? If you think about it, you'll do none of these things, right? And one of the things that tells me, and hopefully that tells you, is that this is not what owners do. The only reason people think that is because when I say what do owners do, they think managers. They don't think owners. And so, if owners don't do this, what do they do? We've basically eliminated all the good answers, right? And so the one thing that I take from this exercise is what owners do and what managers do are different things. And I'm going to talk more about what the owners do now that I think you have this idea that the ownership role and the management role are two different roles. We just think of them as the same role, especially for entrepreneurs. So then, we have one lawyer in the room, we have more. We have 2 lawyers, that's right, we have 2 lawyers in the room. So, what does the law say owners do?
Check the corporate documents.
Well, that's what attorneys suggest to people. But what the law says is that they elect boards of directors. That's the only thing that owners do. How many of you or your clients do that? It's a requirement of the law, and 90% of companies don't even bother with that. So that's not really what owners do either. So we're left with the same question. What do owners do? So before we can talk about underperforming owners, we got to figure out what they're supposed to do, and then we can see if they're underperforming. So this was the dilemma I was left with many years ago. And then I got this idea that said, you know, businesses have plans. They have business plans that they have to do their bank. They have strategic plans that they have to do. They have annual plans that they give their employees. So if managers have plans, why shouldn't owners have plans? And that idea struck me as a really important idea. And out of that, I developed, as Jeff said, something called the owner's plan. And so when I think about what owners do, to me, what they do is that they should create an owner's plan. And an owner's plan is really simply how they're going to own and run their company or their companies. But it's not this. most organizations have their corporate documents. You've got buy-sells, you've got shareholder control agreements, you've got other kinds of documents. Those are all really helpful, like this pointed out. But I'm assuming that most of you know, and I know, many companies that have great corporate documents and are still ripped apart by conflict. And if you think about it, most of the conflict is at the ownership level. You really think about it. So having great corporate documents doesn't prevent you from having a lot of conflict among the ownership groups. That's not what owners fight about. So, just as a way of summary, ownership responsibilities are different than management responsibilities. And being a good president or CEO does not make you a responsible owner. So, when people ask me now that I've thought about this for years and years and years and spoken about it and wrote a book about it, what are owners supposed to do? Well, I say that there's a couple things. They develop an owner's plan. And when I think of an owner's plan, I think of three things. One is the values, needs, and goals of the owners, agreed to by all. Values, needs, and goals. Describing how they want to work together as owners. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. It may have to do with how they make decisions. It may have to do with whether they are going to separate the roles of ownership and management. And thirdly is describing what kind of board arrangement they want, if they want one at all. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to get to the stories and the details. But the owner's plan speaks for all the owners. That's the big idea. That's the big idea. It speaks all the owners come together and they agree. I hope you can read this, but if I try to talk to people about their values, they get all glassy-eyed and it's like, huh? But if I start asking questions about what does it mean to do the right thing? What does it mean to act the right way? How well must I do? What does being on the hook mean? What can I say and what can I say? Then people can start to get a handle on what their values are. And so to me, I just think about owner values. Those are the things that you really start to think about. Needs, of course, are what you need now or what you have and you don't want to give up. It's a little easier to think about what your needs are, but the ideas that I throw out are information, how are we doing? How much money do we need? What am I willing to risk? How can I help? And who does what? And when you start an ownership group talking about those things, you start getting them in the conversations that owners are supposed to have. These are the things that owners are supposed to be talking about. And then, of course, owner goals is what they want long-term or hope for. What is it you're building? What kind of legacy are you building? How much do we want overall? What do we want people to say about us? How management is going to grow the company, and the specific role I want to have. So when you look at the owner's plan with respect to values, needs, and goals, these are some of the questions that you get owners together to talk about. And the ones that they disagree with are the ones that cause the conflicts, that cause the craziness in the business, and all the things that go with that.
Carrie, when you work with an owners group, majority rules, unanimous, just speak a little bit about that. Or maybe I'm jumping ahead.
How the owners work together.
Oh, perfect.
I'm not supposed to have a shill, but I guess I do. One of the biggest questions about how owners work together is how do they make decisions? It's not written in any law how they have to do that. So voting is one of the things that owners need to do so that when they come to the table and they disagree, then they can pull out their document and say, this is how we decided we were going to resolve this, rather than we don't agree, so let's just talk about something else, which is what owners typically do, right? Just talk about something else. So I put 5 things that I think are probably the most most common conflicts. The second one is the compensation, employment, and evaluation of owners who are employees. Whether it's a child or just a partner. How are we going to compensate them? Are we going to evaluate them? What kind of role are they going to get? And again, if you think about this separation of ownership and management, if someone says, I think I ought to be a vice president of the company because I'm an owner, now I hope you're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. Maybe before you came in, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. If you're an owner, you ought to be an officer of the company. But an officer of the company is what managers do. It's not what owners do. So when someone says, I want to have this role because I'm an owner, it shouldn't make any sense anymore. And that's a conversation that people can start to have. Who can be owners? Separating ownership and management, which is a really big deal that we're going to talk about throughout this whole presentation. And then understanding signed documents. I could do an hour just on that alone. And I could ask you a rhetorical question. How many of you guys know the documents you've signed? How many of you know your bank covenants? How many of you can tell me what your buy-sell is if you have partners? How many of you can tell me any shareholder control agreement you have and what that means? And when's the last time you looked at it? It's kind of frightening to think about it.
Here, can I just make one comment? Minnesota changed the law for LLCs. The default used to be percentage ownership is how much percentage vote you got, but the default now is one person, one vote. So you could have a 90% owner that gets one vote and the 10%. That's the default unless your documents say otherwise.
And that is going to cause a lot of conflict in the next year or two. I could just see it.
Good for business.
Well, yes, it's good for business, but it's not good for them. And having it be good for them is what counts. You know, we want to try to make things easier for business owners, and that is really going to make it hard. The third thing about what owners do is this whole idea of how they're going to be governed. And I don't want to say a whole lot about that, but I want to just make the point that whether you have an active board or not, there still are board functions that have to be done. And if you don't want to have a board, as owners, you got to figure out how are we going to get these decisions made, who's going to do that. We're not going to have a board. So you can't just say, we don't have a board, we're too small. Well, legally you do have a board because you signed some documents. But the point is, there are specific roles for boards, and somebody needs to be doing them. Otherwise, the people who are doing them are either going to be doing them and not tell anybody, or they're just going to do them and hope that no one raises their hand and says, wait, I can come. Okay. So, what I want to talk about is underperforming owners. So, what are, or who are underperforming owners? Again, I don't mean to keep nailing the point, but it's not owners who don't do these things well. That's what you hire people to do. One of the things I tell my clients is, you can always hire people to run your company, but you can't hire them to own it. Think about it. You can't hire people to own your company, just to run it and do these things. So to me, underperforming owners are owners that haven't agreed on an owner's plan. They haven't agreed on to speak with one voice. They haven't agreed on their values, needs, and goals. They haven't agreed on how they're going to work together, and they haven't agreed on what kind of board arrangement they want. That, to me, yes?
I just have a question. So how does that impact the management? If those things aren't being done, what's the impact on the management of the business?
Well, that's a really complicated question, but I'll really simplify it. It creates chaos because if you have not separated ownership and management, and you have owners that are working in the business that have different goals, they're going to direct their people to go this way, and other people are going to direct their people to go that way. And employers are caught in the middle. They have 2 masters, 3 masters, 4 masters. They don't really know what to do. The company suffers. Typically, there's, over the course of time, there's less profit, there's more conflict. Good people leave because they can't take it. And then you have things like our manufacturing department can't get anything done, and you think, well, we have a manufacturing problem. And one of the things I typically would point out, and I think you do Institute, Kevin, is this is an ownership problem. All we have to do is find the root of why this conflict is happening, and we'll see that it's an ownership problem. So you create huge havoc. That doesn't mean you can't be successful. It doesn't mean you can't muddle through it. But the amount of stress and drama and craziness that you have to endure to go forward is too much for some people, and other people love it. They do. Some people love it. So why do owners underperform? There's probably a million ideas, but these are the ones that seem to be typical, especially in Minnesota, Wisconsin. The most important one is they don't know what they're supposed to do, because they think they're supposed to do this. Anyone know anyone that's conflict averse? Anyone know any owners that will tell you that they're unhappy with something, but they don't say anything? What's that old Minnesota Scandinavian? I was so mad I almost said something. That's one of the reasons why owners underperform. And while you're doing this, you think you're just protecting your own ideas, but what you're really doing is you're underperforming. You just don't see it that way. One of the big ones, dividends are acceptable. Keep giving me the money, do whatever you want. In my experience, that doesn't last forever. They're afraid of expressing their opinions. They believe that the process of solving it will be too painful. Yeah, less painful than not solving it. Right? I think that's kind of interesting. And then there's a couple others that I want to just go over really briefly. Owners also underperform because they have legal control. Now you might think that doesn't make any sense, but I remember I had a client say to me once, I'm in a great position, Carrie. I have the majority of the stock. I'm the chairman of the board. I am the CEO and president of the company. My owners can't touch me. I can do anything I want. I say that person's underperforming. Does that make any sense to you? They're underperforming because owners have a right to be heard. Even if they only have 10% or 20% or 5%. They have a right to be heard. They have a right to have a seat at the table. And if you have somebody that says, I don't have to listen to you because I have legal control, that's underperforming. Conversely, I don't have legal control, so I can't do anything, is also underperforming. Okay, so I want to go over a couple examples from my client base. Some are family businesses, some are just closely held businesses, but I want to give you a sense for how this thing actually works. So this first story is a dad and 3 children. And dad is the, I won't say classic, but used to be the old-time classic entrepreneur. Bet it all. I'm all in on everything all the time. You ever met someone like that? All in, all the time. Okay? And so everything's going along, the company's growing, and then he sends out this email to his kids that says, I'd like you to put a summary together of your net worth and send it to me. 2 of the kids do. One of the kids says, what do you want that for, Dad? Right? And he says, now that you become owners of this company, we're going all in on everything, and I want to use your assets to increase our buying power at the bank. Because we're going to do this as a family. Why are you shaking your head or smiling? You know, you see the train wreck coming, right? You just see it coming. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, there's several things wrong with this picture. One is that Dad did not consider the other owners' needs and goals, especially their financial needs and goals. Never asked them. Didn't think that his children would have any other opinion besides his. But from a financial point of view, he didn't sit down and go over an owner's plan to talk about how they're going to work together as a group financially. He just made the assumption that that's how it's going to work. And as you could probably guess, there was an explosion in that company, in that family. I think the financial goals of each generation of owners, whether it's family or non-family, matter. And if you ask Dad, it's like, huh? What? I didn't do anything wrong. What are you talking about? Okay. Fast forward to the next one. This is a family farm. Anyone worked on a family farm? Actually, it wasn't a family farm. It was a farm, not a family farm. Anyone worked on a farm? Had a farming plant? Okay, so this is 26 shareholders. It's a large farming operation in Minnesota. 26 shareholders. And there's a president and CEO. This was a time when farmers were fighting for their lives. They were going under in the 80s, going under every day. So this CEO decided, because things weren't working really well, that he was going to lock in prices for the next 4 years. And he sat down and he worked it all out and he figured out if he locked in the prices at a certain level, that they would be able to make it through this recession or whatever it is that they call it. And so he went to the people and he locked it in. And then he called the shareholder meeting. And then he called the shareholder meeting. You got 26 people in the room. And he says, I got good news and I got bad news. The good news is that we're okay for the next 4 years. What's the bad news? The bad news is there's not going to be any distributions for the next 4 years. There was a handful of people that is their only source of income in this group. They didn't like that because they were going to get zero money for the next 4 years. So what is going on with that underperforming owner? Well, the most important thing, and I think you can probably figure this out by now, is he thought ownership management was the same thing. He didn't separate the roles, so he figured as long as he's the CEO, he can make the ownership decisions. That's what he thought in his head, because it hadn't been separated out for him. This is why that separation is so important. And of course, the moral of the story is just because you're the CEO doesn't mean you make the ownership decisions. The owners make the ownership decision, and that's what caused that group to well, they had some really tough times, let's put it that way. Let me go with one example and then one more example, and then we'll get to some more detail here. So this is a really interesting one. This is 5 owners, 20% each, starting a company. They put in their buy-sell that if anybody wants out, they get 10 times profit. EBITDA of 10. Okay? $1 million company, $100,000 profit. Not too bad. So fast forward 25 years. Now they're a $30 million company. They've got a $10 million bottom line. $10 million bottom line. Do the math. That means that each shareholder, if they raise their hand, is entitled to $100 million. Okay? This is a group that did not look at their corporate documents for 30 years, 25 years, and did not get together and talk about it. But the interesting thing is that this conflict that these 5 people had was not about money. Isn't that interesting? And let me tell you why. One is they all had so much money, they were all financially independent. Money was not a motivator for them. What was a motivator for them is two of the owners did not work in the business anymore, and they had moved on, and 3 did. And the 2 owners did not like the way that the 3 were treating the employees. They thought that they were creating a really bad culture and that good people were leaving. So they raised their hand and said, we got to talk about this. And they talked about it. They always lost 3-2 in the vote. And they could not get heard. And so they got together and they thought, the only way we're going to be heard is to raise our hand and say we want out. And that got people's attention because that's $200 million they didn't have. But it took that level of drama to get the owners to the table. So the whole idea of what kind of culture do we want, what kind of employees do we want, what's performance look like, that is what they should have been talking about over those 25 years. Plus, they should have been looking at their corporate documents as well. So those are just a couple examples. So you talked about the consequences, and there's lots of consequences. But the way I look at it is the conflicts go on and on. They take their toll on themselves, their spouses, and the people around them. And then something bad happens. And all the examples I've used today are something bad happens. Because in almost every company I've ever been in, something bad happens along the way. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, it might be 20 years, but something happens along the way. And then you look around the room, it's like, oh man, we got a problem. Why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? And that's the consequence. And that's when you really figure out whether your company's going to make it or not. So, what can you do if you're in an ownership group or you have clients that are in ownership group? What either can you do or recommend? You know, and it sounds really simplistic. The idea and the concept is simplistic. The actual doing of it is not so easy. But agree to put an owner's plan together. Agree to sort out the issues. It sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Agree to, and the best way to do that is to develop an owner's plan, because it's more like control chaos than just chaos, because you've got a series of questions you can answer and a series of topics that you can talk about. And then agree to get all the owners on the same page. So how does the process work? It can work lots of different ways, but if you look at the very basic, agree to speak with one voice. If you can't agree to speak with one voice, don't even bother, because you're never going to get anywhere. But most people will agree because they're thinking that they're going to get their way, right? So most people will agree to speak with one voice. Have all the owners go back and think about their values, needs, and goals, how they want to work together, and what kind of governance they want. Come back and talk about it. If they're willing to do that, that's another step that you can take. And then the one that people typically don't do is take all those issues, and instead of having a free-for-all, divide them into owner issues, board issues, manager issues. Start that process of separating those roles out. And then start to look at the owner problems and say, let's just take these problems first, because these are the core. And typically I found that if you can solve the owner problems, 90% of the board management problems go away. Because once you start looking at the ownership issues, you're really at the root of the problem, and all the result of the problem issues tend to go away. Tackle them one by one and discuss them until you get an agreement, if you can.
Carrie, can I just share, you know, the financial needs, you might have 3 siblings and one died, so now you have the nieces and nephews. So at the table you have 2 of them that are thinking about retirement, and the other owner group is thinking about funding their kids' education.
Exactly. Exactly.
Or you have one sibling is frugal, and the other one spends money like they have everything they need. The issues that come to the table.
And that's a really common one, because people are at different stages of their life. That's the whole idea of having people articulate their needs, and articulate their needs as they change. Because over the course of time, the person who is wanting to reap the rewards, because they have kids in school and that sort of thing, that may not have been there 20 years ago. So as their needs and their goals change, I think it's important, and I would even say essential, to keep communicating those things to the other owners, so you don't go 20 years down the road and you walk into the ownership table and you say, our dividends need to triple because I got kids in college and I just bought a new home. Well, is that even germane? I don't know. Might be, might not be, but that's when you get those kinds of conflicts. But that doesn't mean there's not an answer. sometimes you have to get creative. Sometimes you have to make a short-term plan and a long-term plan, and they might be different plans. The point is, if you don't talk about it, you'll never get an agreement. So, this is what I'm always asked. What happens if we can't agree? Right? That's probably what you're thinking too. You know, the problems are too fundamental, people are too selfish, I'm not going to give on anything, but I don't have the power to make it happen, so what do I do? Well, I think there's 3 things you can do. I like the first one, try again. Just because something didn't work the first time doesn't mean you don't do it again. I mean, you guys are all successful in your business. Have you ever tried something and it didn't work, you said, well, I'm not going to do that again? No, you try again, and again, and again, right? That's what you do. That's why you're here in this room. The second one is the easiest one, part ways. Well, we can't come up with a plan, so let's just figure out a way to sell. Either you go away or I go away, or we figure out how we're going to do that. I think that's a legitimate option. And the third one, which is typically what we do, right, is we live with it. It's like, okay, I don't want to talk about this anymore. This is really frustrating. I haven't slept in days. I'm just gonna say let's stop meeting. Let's just go back to whatever we were. And everybody has their own disappointments. I put that up there because that's probably the one we do the most of. It's not the one I would typically recommend, but it's the one we typically do the most of. I'm just gonna live. Now, some of you, in fact, I think I know some of you here, that you might be the only owner in the company. And if you have employees, how does this relate to me? What I wrote, and I see this over and over again. If you don't tell your employees where it is you want to go and what the values, needs, and goals of the company ought to be, and how you want to work with them, then they have to play what I call guess what's in the owner's head. For those of you who've been employees, any of you ever done that? Has it ever worked? Long term. It never works long term. You can't guess what's in the owner's head long term for lots of reasons. One is we just can't guess that well. Second of all, some of the entrepreneurs are flighty. They change their mind. They make left turns. They make right turns. They sort of do whatever they want. If you're the only owner and you have employees and you say, I don't need an owner's plan, because that's all about when owners come together and that sort of thing. And I do this stuff anyways because I'm the owner and I'm the manager and everything. You still owe it to your employees to give them the roadmap so that they can do a good job for you. In my experience, some ownership groups do really well at resolving conflicts, and they don't put an owner's plan together because they have a way or a culture or a pattern of figuring out how to do that. And for those groups, I say more power to you because you found a way to deal with conflict, and that's excellent if you can do that. Some groups aren't quite as successful at trying to do that because they don't have the wherewithal or the stamina or the intestinal fortitude to do that. And then again, they either go into buy-sell mode or they just live with it. And I've seen that, and sometimes it can really bust up an ownership group or a family. And just one really quick story. I remember walking into office of this president, CEO, entrepreneur, dad, family guy. And there used to be other family members of sort of other branches of the tree. And I asked him how come that wasn't around anymore. He said, well, we tried to work it out and it didn't work out, so they all got bought out. And I said, well, do you still speak to each other? Did you do it in a way that ensured integrity in the family? So he goes over to the closet, pulls out this really big box, and he opens it up, and it's about this big. It was the other branch of the family's entire photo of everything that had to do with this client, and all the pictures were cut too. So that's the last communication I got from them. So, dramatic effect. Some groups seek out third parties because there are people that can walk them through those kinds of things. And I know I typically get involved when people are no longer okay with how bad things are. That's typically because we can endure a lot, right? Oh, we can just endure a lot. But with a lot of companies, they get to the point where the way it's been for years and years and years is just not okay anymore. And that's typically when I get involved. And my goal is always to make sure, above all, that once this thing is done, that the family can sit down for Thanksgiving dinner and talk about it, and I'll invite everybody and not start cutting up their photographs. It's really bad. So, parting thought. And I've talked about this a little bit, but as we get older, our values, needs, and goals change, but the idea of communicating them to other people, somehow that doesn't occur to us. And so I would definitely encourage you, those of you who have partners or employees, to talk about how your values, needs, and goals are changing. On an annual basis. If you do it on an annual basis, you might as well do an owner's plan, because that's a document. It can be a legally binding document. It can be part of a shareholder control agreement. It can be separate from a shareholder control agreement. And it might sound daunting to you, but my philosophy is conflict that goes on forever is a lot more daunting than the process of trying to figure out how you're going to work together or partner together. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming on this dreary day. Anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to make? Yes, Mr. Ryan.
So I was working with a client in St. Paul, and the CEO of the company was 65. He mentioned the fact that he wanted to retire. And one of the guys that was with me said, well, you're 65, why don't you retire? He said, well, Dad won't let me.
That's great, and there's a comic too, if you've ever seen it, where the 65-year-old guy has his arm around his son in the window and overlooking his big estate, and he says, "Someday this will all be yours as soon as Dad gives it to me." It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Rick?
Yeah, so you've done a lot of work over the years with family-owned businesses. Obviously, that would be a whole another topic, but if there were 2 or 3 kind of addendums to what you said here that you would say in the situation of a family-owned business, something might do a little differently, or how you might finesse some of the more sensitive matters or whatever.
I think one of the things about the family business that you have to really include very strongly in these kinds of owners' plans is the whole idea of transition and succession. It's not quite as important if you're in a law firm and the junior partner becoming senior partners, that sort of thing. They still have conflict, but when you get to the family business, part of the values, needs, and goals has to be what's going to happen with the senior generation. How does the next generation come in? And if that's not part of the discussion, you can resolve a lot of conflict, but you haven't resolved the most important thing long term that's going to be required to make that business stay whole in the next generation.
Terry did this presentation or similar presentation back in 2004 or 5. And a woman came, her dad started a steel business. Her ex-husband was the CEO. She didn't work at the company, but she went in and was really offended when they wouldn't give her the time records for all the employees. Like, well, as an owner, why the heck do you need it? Well, one of her values that hadn't been articulated was that family was important. We shouldn't have our people doing overtime, which was a very legitimate owner value thing that they might have articulated, but, you know, she just barged into the HR because she's an owner. And,
Exactly.
but it was her ex-husband who Dad had anointed to run the business even after they were divorced. So.
And the fact of the matter is, and this seems like a really harsh statement, but I believe it 100%, is that as an owner, you're not entitled to go into the company and ask anybody to do anything. You're not on the org chart.
This, I've introduced Carrie's work in my Gazelles community, international coaching community, and particularly in Central and South America. They really don't have a market to sell companies. So the history has been they go to the eldest male, which isn't necessarily the person that ought to be running the company. So these coaches are very intrigued with this idea of having an owner's plan and a succession plan. And so Carrie's actually done a hour-long presentation that's in the Gazelles Growth Institute webinar series with his book. It's really good stuff. Thanks, Carrie, for coming.
And I've got a handout for everybody that just summarizes some of the main points if you'd like it.
So we used to have, you know, when I opened my office, my dad came up from Cedar Rapids and I said, "Hey, Dad, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I have a gift for you." And he had fabricated a neon shark that he came up, drove up 5 hours just to give me, and I have neon shark at the front of our building, and the one that he gave me is still illuminated in his office, and it looks something like this. And so, in appreciation of Carrie's coming here today, we have this luggage tag with his name that our video guy, John Zorn's good friend, we just ordered a dozen of these for our family because my daughter moved to a new house, so everybody, all of our luggage have neon sharks. They're very easy to identify when they come off of the luggage racks. So thanks again. So have a great Thanksgiving. Be thankful. December, Isaac Russell will be here, and
Don't miss that one.
Isaac is quite the character. We've become kind of kindred spirits.
He's a
And,
Southern gentleman from Alabama.
And one of the reasons he comes to Minnesota is because the Southern boardrooms aren't too open to black consultants. And he's a great guy. He worked with Golden Plumb, the executive team at Golden Plumb, for like 14 years until they sold the buildings. Great guy. So he'll be a good presentation. Thanks for coming. Have a great day.